The history of transatlantic travel has seen the development of many of the most technologically advanced machines of the 19th and 20th centuries. Within the scope of their creation was a marriage of function and grace rarely seen in modern endeavors. The legacy of these great passenger liners now resides primarily in museums, like the Mariners Museum, where the model builder's art constantly reminds us of these magnificent machines. Early transatlantic crossings had been a misery for the thousands of immigrants who came to America. But by the 20th century, the crossing had become a glamorous enterprise. And the star of this enterprise was the luxury passenger liner. Making the crossing in the safety and comfort of a famous liner became the holiday excursion for wealthy travelers from Europe and America. The ships were legends, representing the technological superiority of the designers, builders, operators, and even the countries from which they came. Names such as the Great Eastern, the Leviathan, the Mauretania, and the Queen Mary were household words to maritime enthusiasts. They were not unfamiliar to the man whose dream would become the reality of the greatest passenger liner ever built in America. This is the story of that superliner, the SS United States, and the man who conceived her, William Francis Gibbs.
He was a very interesting man. Most people think of him as a naval architect and a ship designer, and he's got the medals to prove it. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Gibbs was not educated as an engineer or a naval architect, but he had a drive and a vision, which he must have had long before I knew him, probably dating back to his childhood, to create vessels, ships. As far as I know, he always wanted to see a ship like the United States.
Trained as a lawyer in deference to his father, Gibbs abandoned law and joined with his brother Frederick to pursue his passion for ship design. With a combination of genius and daring, they persuaded the financier J.P. Morgan to back their plans to build a 1,000-foot superliner. With a brash enthusiasm and the support of the Secretary of the Navy, they drew plans for their dream ship, and in July of 1916 it was tested in the Navy's model tank. The model they tested called for 180,000 horsepower in an era when the fastest ship in the world, the Mauretania, was driven by 70,000 horsepower. It was to be no ordinary passenger liner. The United States declaration of war in April 1917 halted the development of the new liner and led to a conversion project that was to secure the reputation of William Francis Gibbs as the preeminent marine designer in the United States. The project was the conversion of the seized German liner Vaterland from its troopship configuration back to the passenger liner Leviathan. The project was undertaken with enthusiasm, and its highly successful conclusion enhanced the growing reputations of Gibbs as a designer and Frederick as a financial wizard. From this conversion, Gibbs also learned a practical lesson in the design criteria for building a passenger liner which could easily be converted to a troopship. Gibbs was able to put this experience to good use when he was awarded the design contract for the passenger liner America in 1937. Construction of the America began in August of 1938, and she was launched a year later on August 31st, 1939. On the day following her christening by Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, Poland was invaded by Hitler. The America's planned European trips were canceled, and after a short commercial career spent cruising the Caribbean, she was converted to a troopship capable of carrying nearly 9,000 men. By the war's end, the America had safely transported more than 300,000 troops, a tribute to the lessons learned by William Francis Gibbs in the conversion of the Leviathan.
I think you could say the America was a forerunner of the United States. It had a lot of the basic features, but not the refinements to them, shall we say. Mr. Gibbs would go to prospective clients and tell them what they should have. You know, insist on features which were probably more expensive than they wanted, but because they were the highest degree of safety or whatever, reliability, he would insist that they use them. He was a genius, I think, more in the sense of being an organizer, of being able to give people an idea that they would carry out for him. He didn't really design ships himself, you understand. He caused them to be designed.
The America had given Gibbs the distinction of designing the largest passenger ship ever built in the United States. But it was not the superliner he had envisioned in his designs of 1915 and 1916. His plans to build that superliner were once again interrupted by a world war.
I'm not sure of the number, but over 70% of the tonnage launched during World War II was launched to Gibbs and Cox designs.
It was a remarkable achievement which included the design of destroyers, cruisers, landing craft, and liberty ships. More than 5,000 ships in all. The recognition Gibbs received for his war efforts assured his place as America's foremost naval architect. It was an ideal position from which he could resume his efforts to build a 1,000-foot superliner. By the war's end, the political climate for rebuilding the American merchant marine fleet was very favorable. Included in this climate was a recognition of the need for a wartime troop ship capability. With the cooperation of the United States lines and the government, it was decided that a superliner should be built. From his office in New York, called the Glass Menagerie by his staff, Gibbs would oversee in minute detail the design and construction of the liner which had become his lifelong ambition. It was apparent from the outset that the design, financing, and construction of the SS United States would be no ordinary undertaking. It would require the cooperation of the Navy, the United States lines, and ultimately the builder, Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company.
He came to me to draw the lines for the United States. He gave me the prismatic coefficient, the waterline length of 940 feet, and overall length he wanted 988 feet, and the beam was to be 101 foot 6 inches, and the draft 31 feet. This was on a Monday morning. And he said, I'll be back Saturday afternoon to get the product.
With financial assistance from a Navy subsidy, design work moved quickly, and on April 5, 1948, a model of the liner was displayed for dignitaries and the press. And almost a year later, to the day, April 7, 1949, the construction contract was signed with Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. While final design plans were being completed, extensive testing was carried out for everything, from smokestack configuration to anchor and hawse pipe design to flame-retarding paints. Full-size stateroom models were constructed, filled with typical baggage, and tested for flammability.
The United States was one of the safest ships ever built, for the simple reason that William Francis Gibbs insisted on the safety features that were built into the ship. She was very well compartmented and fireproof throughout.
The keel was laid in February of 1950, and hull number 488 began to take shape.
Well, we knew it was a passenger liner. We built the America, and everybody was proud of the America, but this was supposed to be better than the America. As a shipwright, we were responsible for the alignment of the ship. when the first piece of keel came in, it was nothing but a flat plate. I set the plate down on the dock floor, or on the blocks, pull it to get it on center line, the frame line, then tie it down to the dock floor.
To achieve the speeds Gibbs envisioned, almost the entire superstructure was built of aluminum. Over 60,000 square feet of aluminum decking. 1.5 million aluminum rivets were used during construction.
When we got up into the superstructure of the United States, just about everything was aluminum. And that was the biggest mass of aluminum that we had ever worked with in the shipyard. So therefore, we had a lot of problems. We'd set a piece of aluminum today, put rivets in it tonight maybe, tomorrow morning it was broken loose. Everyone knew that Gibbs was there. Everybody knew him, not just as I did, not to speak to him, but they knew when he came by, it was the designer, and he was looking to make sure that everything was going just like he put it.
It was this attention to detail in all aspects of the ship's design and construction which characterized his attitude about the United States. It was, after all, a ship that he had been planning to build for more than 30 years.
William Francis Gibbs was a perfectionist, and he had to have everything just so. Money was no object as far as William Francis Gibbs was concerned. Of course, I imagine the company had other things to say about that too, but he always put the finest materials in that ship.
For the sake of safety, Gibbs demanded that no wood be used in either the construction materials or the furnishings on the ship.
You know, Mr. Gibbs was a fanatic as far as wood was concerned, and he'd look around and see what was, if anything was wood around there, he had it removed or had it replaced. When the ship was coming out, Mr. Gibbs went to Mr. Steinway when they were building the pianos, the grand piano for the ship and so forth. And he tried to convince Mr. Steinway that they ought to have metal cases as far as the pianos were concerned. And of course, you know, they would not have the sound effects and so forth with a piano. So Mr. Steinway finally convinced Mr. Gibbs that they would fireproof the wood that they were going to use in the pianos. Believe that or not.
Of course, we went on to the fireproofing. Everybody knows that the only wood in the ship were chopping block and the piano. There were a few other splinters here and there, I can tell you, but basically there were no flammables. The curtains, the furnishings, all of that material was fireproof.
Gibbs imposed a veil of secrecy over the design of the United States, especially those factors related to the engine, hull, and propellers. He alluded to War Department restrictions, but in reality, he was determined to prevent his competitors from learning the secrets of his beloved ship. At the insistence of Gibbs, the ship had been built in dry dock to help conceal the underwater shape of the vessel. The launching, therefore, required only the removal of shoring timbers and the flooding of the dry dock. When Mrs. Harry S. Truman declined the invitation to launch the ship, Mrs. Tom Connolly, the wife of a well-known Texas senator, christened her, and the United States was floated on June 23, 1951, and moved to the outfitting pier where another year of finishing work got underway. 700 aluminum frames for crew berths were manufactured and installed. The decks were cleaned, sanded, and covered with 9 coats of protective paint. Aluminum railings were added, deck winches installed and tested. Aluminum lifeboats with sufficient capacity to carry both passengers and crew were tested and attached to their davits. The galley was completed and outfitted. Decorative flags were added to the swimming pool, which boasted a simulated sand beach for the bathers. Sculptress Gwen Lux completed Expressions of Freedom for the main dining room. It was constructed of foam glass, a lightweight, non-flammable material. Nearly 3,000 workers swarmed over the United States. As she neared completion, plans were made for the builder's trial runs, with high expectations that she would be the fastest passenger liner ever built. On May 14, 1952, the United States left for the builder's sea trials, which were conducted 100 miles off the Virginia coast in 1,000 fathoms of water. The ship's speed was measured using a new electronic tracking system of extraordinary accuracy, called a radist system. A gale blew up overnight, and as the radist buoys were launched, the wind freshened to 35 knots. The United States moved into position for the trials in worsening sea conditions. As the trial runs began, the wind reached gale proportions of 45 knots. Alternate runs of 5 miles were made, against and with the wind. Despite the weather conditions, the United States completed the runs at an average speed in excess of 34 knots. Additional trial runs were conducted under more favorable conditions, and her top speed was established at 38.32 knots. Mr. Gibbs was pleased. The ship had met his expectations, and he was ready to make a record-setting Atlantic crossing. Preparations for the maiden voyage had been underway for many months, and her arrival in New York to board passengers was celebrated by a flotilla of tugs.
And there was some little fuss when we got up to New York, the little blowing of whistles and that sort of thing. After 2 weeks of parties for the executives of the line and their invited guests, we had the start of the maiden voyage.
The departure was a festive occasion, with celebrations to the accompaniment of the orchestras.
It was usually broken up into 3 bands: first class, cabin, and tourist. And you'd usually play a tea concert. Then about 6:30 would be dinner. And that would be probably play until 9 o'clock. You'd start again about 10 o'clock at night and play for whatever time was appropriate, probably about 2 hours.
Mr. Gibbs joined a celebrity passenger list which included Milton Berle and Margaret Truman.
I looked up when someone spoke, and it was Margaret Truman. She had come out of her way to tell me how she had enjoyed the music, and she's just a lovely person.
The ship's captain, Commodore Harry Manning, turned aside questions about breaking the speed record as he greeted passengers and welcomed celebrities on the bridge.
It started out, as I said, very badly, because the first 2 days were fog, absolutely dismal. And they showed the good judgment to go very slow. By the end of the second day, I personally had just about given up on the idea of breaking the record. But on the third day, it was pretty well clear, and that ship just took off. It was unbelievable to me, the incredible speed it was traveling.
The record was broken as the United States raced past Bishop's Rock and made a triumphant entry into Southampton. Winston Churchill's telegram of congratulations arrived along with an overwhelming ovation from a convoy of small boats accompanying the ship into the harbor. Thousands of Britons crowded boats and docks to celebrate the spectacular American thoroughbred. Many passengers were surprised at the warmth of the welcome from the country whose Queen Mary had just lost the Hales Trophy.
I noticed on the landing stage a group of people standing on the pier looking up at the front of the ship. So I wanted to check that out. So I went ashore, went up to the front, and of course the whole ship had been impeccably prepared, and this beautiful black paint all over, except on the very front, the prow, the black paint had just been taken off just by the sheer force of going through the water at such speed.
Why was it fast? Well, it was fast because it had a great deal of horsepower and because it was also very fine. Well, I don't want to be too technical about it, but you don't fill up a lot of volume in a ship if you want it to be efficient through the water.
Everyone concerned with the design, construction, and operation of the vessel was understandably pleased at her performance on the maiden voyage. The celebrations and accolades surrounding her record-setting maiden voyage gave way to a year of 46 successful crossings.
After the maiden voyage, we cut down on the speed. We only used 6 boilers instead of the usual 8. And we were able to maintain a 32-knot schedule. And we never had a major breakdown.
It was this standard of reliability and service which was to secure the reputation of the United States.
Well, I joined the ship in September of 1955 as executive officer and relieving master. Commodore Anderson, John Anderson, was the Commodore at that time. And I relieved Commodore Anderson 44 different times before he retired. In February of 1964, I was informed by the United States Lines that I was to be the next captain of the ship, next master of the ship. And I was very thrilled because I never dreamt that I would become the permanent master of a wonderful vessel like the United States.
Although William Francis Gibbs was never to take another Atlantic crossing on the ship, he followed its career with an intense interest.
William Francis Gibbs used to call us at sea every day to find out how the ship was doing, and he also met the ship every time we docked in New York and every time we sailed.
Gibbs could easily recognize the vessel as it approached the dock.
Another thing about the whistles. When the ship was being built, Mr. Gibbs was very, very fussy about the sound of the whistles. We had 3 whistles. 2 were in the forward stack and 1 in the after stack. And he wanted a certain tone, and he took them out to the Jersey Meadows. And he toned the whistles with a tuning fork, so you could always tell when the United States was sailing or coming into the harbor, you could always tell it was the United States just by the tone of her whistles.
The ship's reputation attracted a variety of famous passengers.
The liner United States brings Harry S. Truman and Mrs. Truman home from Europe. With the Democratic Convention due in August, the man who served more than 7 years in the White House makes big news. The Trumans count the minutes until reunion with their only daughter, Margaret, and their son-in-law, Clifton Daniel, Jr.
President Truman was aboard. The morning we arrived in New York, we used to arrive off Staten Island about 6 o'clock in the morning. And who came up to the bridge to thank us all for a delightful voyage but President and Mrs. Truman. Now, you wouldn't expect the president to get up that early in the morning to come down and say thank you very much. We carried John Wayne, and we carried Bob Hope, and we also carried President and Mrs. Eisenhower.
When you play deck music, anyone like Bob Hope is usually there, and he's a very approachable person, and people are around him all the time.
The liner United States brings England its ambassador from Hollywood, Bob Hope.
I just want to tell you that it's been a wonderful trip on this United States. It was a great, great trip. That's a beautiful ship, and I understand the Cunard Line gave it a 21 torpedo salute when it came in today.
Over the years, the list of notable passengers included Fred McMurray, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, Princess Frederica of Greece, Marilyn Monroe, Red Skelton, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Walt Disney, Tennessee Williams, Lord Mountbatten, Leopold Stokowski, John Kennedy, Jimmy Stewart, and Princess Grace.
A photographer is prone on the deck to get his angle view as Princess Grace and Prince Rainier make their morning appearance before many of us have had breakfast. Fellow passengers strain for a glimpse of their Serene Highnesses from Monaco. Princess Grace is looking forward to motherhood in February.
The United States completed voyage number 352 on September 5th, 1967. William Francis Gibbs died the following morning. His beloved ship remained popular with passengers but continuing government subsidies were necessary to maintain her operation. This political problem was complicated by a series of labor disputes, and passenger lists grew shorter as transatlantic flight service became more popular. Returning from her 400th voyage, she was scheduled to visit Newport News Shipbuilding for her annual overhaul.
About the 13th of November, if I remember correctly, 1969, when we received a call from the New York office telling us that the ship was to be laid up. Now, we were preparing for a round-the-world voyage at this time, so it came as a great shock.
The United States was berthed at Newport News Shipbuilding, where it became obvious that the ship would not be returned to service quickly. With docking fees mounting and no serious prospects of returning to service, the ship was moved to Norfolk International Terminals, where the U.S. Maritime Administration took full title of the ship. As months languished into years, the inevitable consequences of prolonged neglect tarnished the ship. Interior appointments and furnishings were stripped and sold at auction, and in 1989 the United States was evicted from her Norfolk dock and again returned to Newport News. Once the pride of American industry and technology, she now seemed destined for the scrap pile.
$2,600,000.
A public auction for unpaid docking fees saved the ship from the indignity of scrapping. Plans were quickly made to tow the ship to Turkey with the intention of returning her to cruise service.
Now I'm hopeful that something's going to happen with the ship rather than sitting here at an old coal pier.
Her new owner, Fred Meyer, the president of Marmar Marine, had been a passenger on the ship in 1963.
Well, everything of this nature starts, I think, with a dream.
On June 4th, 1992, the United States left for Turkey.
And the sea is 2 to 4 feet, increasing 4 to 6 feet. That's good. No problem for you.
No, it looks nice. Okay.
And have a good voyage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
The ship that had logged over 2.5 million miles and carried more than 1 million passengers was to make yet another crossing. She took with her the wishes of thousands who remember her as the greatest passenger liner ever built.
The Midwest strength and Texas space, she's got the Southland's charm, the nation's pace, she's got freedom's form and liberty's face. So salute the United States, proclaim triumphantly with a mighty voice, the people's choice. She's the first lady of the sea.